Hello everyone, welcome to our webinar today. The topic of today's webinar is the Offshore Wind R&D Consortium, Roadmap, Research Priorities, and the Open Solicitation. This webinar is being presented by the Clean Energy States Alliance, also known as CESA, as part of the Northeast Wind Resource Center. And our host for this webinar is CESA Project Director Val Stori. I'll be passing it over to her in just a moment to give us some more of an introduction, and then she'll pass it over to our guest speakers. But before we do that, I'd like to go over a few quick housekeeping notes. So all of our attendees on this webinar are muted by default. So we can't hear you, but hopefully you can hear us. You have a couple of options to join the audio portion of the webinar. You can call in using your telephone, or you can connect using the computer mic and speakers. We ask that you please submit your questions and your comments using the question box on the webinar console and hitting send. Please do that throughout the webinar and type your questions in when you think of them. Don't wait until the very end to submit your questions. We'll get to as many questions as we can. We're going to save about 15 minutes at the end of our presentations for a Q&A with the audience. And to make sure that we get to your question, again, type it in when you think of it. Don't wait until the very end. And a final note, this webinar is being recorded. We'll send you an email within the next day or two with a copy of the webinar recording and a PDF of all the webinar slides. And we'll also be posting it on our website at cesa.org/webinars. That's a good URL to know because that's also where we post not only all of our webinar recordings, but also information about upcoming webinars. So with that, I would like to pass it over to Val Stori. Like I said, Val is a project director here at the Clean Energy States Alliance.
Thank you, Sam. Hello, everyone, and thanks for joining today's webinar. CESA is hosting the webinar. CESA is a national nonprofit organization. We work with public agencies across the U.S., which are mostly state energy offices, and you can see who those members are on your screen now. And we work with these members and others to advance and promote renewable energy technology and markets through policy, finance, and program support, and a lot of outreach, such as this webinar. And as Sam mentioned, this webinar is hosted by two programs at the Clean Energy States Alliance. One is the Northeast Wind Resource Center, which we started with DOE funding, I'd say about 4 years ago. And we work on sharing fact-based information on offshore and land-based wind energy, specifically in the Northeast. And it's also sponsored by another project that CESA manages called the Offshore Wind Accelerator Program, or OAP. And OAP has two main focuses. One is working with states on an individual basis and also on a multi-state regional basis to help the states advance offshore wind. And we also engage in broad-ranging outreach and communications about offshore wind development policies and any other offshore wind-related news. And you can follow OAP through our website. You can sign up for our OAP newsletter. You can follow us on Facebook and Twitter. All right, so moving on to the meat of today's webinar, we have two guest panelists, Walt Musial and Richard Bourgeois, who are going to be talking to you today about a relatively new national offshore wind research and development consortium, which is a $41 million effort that's being led by NYSERDA in partnership with the DOE. And the consortium's focus is on industry collaboration to identify research and development activities that will reduce the levelized cost of energy of offshore wind. Back in November, the consortium released an R&D roadmap, and then they followed up with the organization's first solicitation in March. So you're going to hear about the roadmap and the R&D priorities identified in the roadmap, and you'll also learn about the research priorities for the first solicitation from our two great guest speakers. We will first hear from Richard Bourgeois, who is a senior program manager at NYSERDA, which is the New York State Energy Research and Development Authority. And Richard manages a portfolio in renewable energy and energy storage. and he's serving as the principal investigator for NYSERDA and DOE's National Offshore Wind R&D Consortium. He's a licensed professional engineer in New York State with a master's in mechanical engineering from Rensselaer Polytech Institute. So I'll pass it over to Richard, and then I will introduce Walt when Walt begins his presentation. And as Sam said, just a reminder to type in questions as they come up for you, and at the end I will moderate a Q&A. Thanks, everyone.
Okay, thanks very much, Val. Hi, this is Richard, and it looks like I have the ball. Great. So thanks everyone for tuning in to the webinar today. I'll start off by speaking a little bit about the consortium and some of its priorities before turning it over to Walt, who will go through the research and development roadmap in a bit more detail. So as Val mentioned, this began as a DOE initiative. They put out a funding opportunity announcement in December of 2017 to find an administrator for a national offshore wind R&D consortium with the goal of reducing the levelized cost of energy of offshore wind in the U.S. By means of supporting innovations that would be responsive to the real barriers to lowering cost and developing technology and supply chain that offshore wind project developers are facing in the U.S. Along the way, it's an intention to build strong networks connecting innovators, investors in industry so we can commercialize the technology and also increase opportunities for U.S. manufacturing and jobs. NYSERDA was the winning proposal along with our partners, including NREL, Renewable's consulting group, and the Carbon Trust. As Val mentioned, this is a $41 million project initially, with half roughly coming from Department of Energy funds, with the rest matched by NYSERDA. And there are additional contributions from consortium sponsoring members. And the DOE NYSERDA funding is for 4 years of awards. But one of the reasons, of course, that we've set this up with independent private sponsors is the intention is to continue contributing technology to the U.S. offshore wind industry for far longer than that initial 4 years. So why was NYSERDA so interested in this? We have of course, a very strong commitment in New York State to offshore wind. Governor Cuomo has set a target of 9,000 megawatts installed by 2035, largest commitment in the United States. And we see the goals of the consortium as matching our own. We need to reduce levelized cost of energy in order to deliver those 9 gigawatts to our ratepayers at good reasonable price, and we recognize that a truly national effort is required in order to achieve that. So what is the consortium? So as we've said a couple times, this is an independent not-for-profit, and we want to set it up to do a lot more than just deliver that $41 million worth of research. Recognizing that that's a lot and it's a good start, but if you look at consortia in Europe, many of those are invested for much more than that, and we recognize that this is going to need to continue again beyond that initial 4-year period. So we've assembled, I think, a really outstanding group of public and private sponsors as well as key national stakeholders. You'll see that we have 10 developer members, representing, I think, the leaders in the U.S. offshore wind industry. Public sponsors besides NYSERDA and the U.S. Department of Energy include Virginia's Department of Mines, Minerals, and Energy, Mass CEC, and the Maryland Energy Administration, and I know that some of those are also members of CESA, which is fantastic. Also joining the consortium as independent members are our chair, Bob Cattell, who also runs the Advanced Energy Research and Technology Center at Stony Brook. Our partners from the Carbon Trust and RCG, representing the interests and perspective of National Labs, Sam Aronson, who's Director Emeritus from BNL, and representing National Utilities, John Bruckner, who's the President of National Grid in New York. We also have one private sponsor, and Barrick, and hope to again grow in all of these areas. Critical to have these voices at the table guiding the consortium and giving us that strong market pull to direct the innovation towards again solving the barriers that those developers face in the U.S. market. In addition, we have 4 advisory groups. So advisory group membership is not a sponsoring membership, and it's larger and wider than those sponsoring members who sit on the board. I'll go into those in a bit more detail later, but each of those is targeted to address a different aspect of getting voice of customer, industry perspective, and stakeholder perspective to fit out our research and development plans. So Val mentioned the roadmap, and I hope that at least some of the folks on the call have had the opportunity to take a look at it. This is something that Walt Musial has led very well putting together, and the intent of the roadmap is to fully describe, at the moment the roadmap is released anyway, what is the consortium's perspective of what those barriers are towards lower cost of energy offshore wind in the United States, and what are the technical topic areas that need to be addressed in order to get us to the goal. It follows the 3 research pillars, which I think many on this call will be familiar with, that were first advanced in 2016 by DOE and Department of Interior. They are number 1, offshore wind plant technology advancement. Pillar 2 is offshore wind power resource and site characterization. And number 3 covers installation, operation and maintenance, and supply chain solutions. So the roadmap covers topics in all 3 of those areas, those 3 research pillars, which again Walt will address in some detail. We also put out our first notice of upcoming technical challenges immediately following the roadmap in November, and the solicitation that's out now and available in accepting proposals was released at the end of March for 4 technical challenge areas in Pillar 1. And again, that's open right now, and we are accepting proposals. And right, so you can access that via NYSERDA's regular funding opportunity page. NYSERDA is managing that solicitation on behalf of the consortium, so you would apply there as you would for any NYSERDA funding opportunity. There's the website, and it's important to note here that the solicitation we intended to remain open throughout the length of the 4-year period and perhaps beyond with additional funding. And it will be continually updated with additional technical challenge areas, revised technical challenge areas, and where we in the consortium feel that the technical challenges, that one particular, say, technical challenge area has been fully satisfied, it may be removed from the solicitation. So it's intended to be a living document that we respond to the market and that we respond to advances in the research landscape continually. In fact, we have an update coming out to it soon, which I can't announce the content of yet, but which will add additional technical challenge areas for Pillar 2 and Pillar 3. So with that, I will turn it over to Walt to go into more detail on the research and development priorities.
All right, thank you, Richard. Just a reminder to folks to type in questions for later, and you'll have an opportunity to ask those of Richard later. So next up, we will hear from Walt Musial. He's the principal engineer and the offshore wind lead at the National Renewable Energy Lab, otherwise known as NREL, where he's worked for 31 years. In 2003, he initiated the Offshore Wind Energy Research Program at NREL, which has a focus on a wide range of industry needs and on critical technical challenges. He earned his bachelor and master's degrees at UMass Amherst, and he's written over 100 publications and has 2 patents. Thanks for being with us, Walt.
Thank you. Let's see if I can take control. Good. Okay, so I'm going to just continue on the topics that Richard has already introduced. And what I want to do is get into a more of a description of what the roadmap is, what's in the roadmap, how we went from the roadmap to these challenge areas, and then ultimately the challenge areas became what's embedded in the solicitation that's out right now. And this process of down selecting from the roadmap and going into what becomes part of the solicitation is going to continue, as Richard said. We don't have an exact time schedule on that, but this is an open, both the solicitation and the roadmap are living documents that will be updated as we go. So we came up with some principles that guide the prioritization of this research. First of all, what gets into the roadmap, and then what goes from the roadmap into the solicitations. And primarily, we're looking for projects that are engineering and technology based. So these are more science-based projects. They're focused on the needs of the end users, however. And this is an important distinction. The end users, in our case, are really defined as the developers who have an interest in putting in the first projects in the United States. I've shown a map here on the right that indicates there's about 31, 32 projects on this is just the East Coast and the Great Lakes. There's also a lot of activity already going in California and Hawaii, which we take into account as well, and that includes new technologies that are addressed by floating systems. So we have in our technology for our first pillar, which is wind plant technology, we've divided that into floating technology and fixed bottom technology. We have an interest to make sure that the projects that are proposed and selected have broad benefits to the U.S. industry and not just for one developer to develop their project. So that's very important. And that the projects are tailored to specific U.S. issues as much as possible. So we recognize that there's a lot of research dollars floating out there from the EU and other agencies in the world, and a lot of the generic issues are being addressed. But to the extent that's possible, we'd like to make sure that the projects proposed in this consortium focus on U.S. specific issues and enabling the end users, as we've said, the developers here, to bring to market the projects and the innovations that are proposed, and bring that and help them accelerate the progress that's made in the U.S. here. And finally, we recognize that this all became possible because DOE had a funding opportunity, 1767, which, as Richard went through, was won by NYSERDA, and this funding opportunity had certain suggestions in language that we're adhering to, and as we go forward, you'll hear about that. So there were the three pillars that we refer to: the wind plant technology, siting and resource, and then installation, O&M, and supply chain issues. And so those were the three pillars, and I'm going to talk about those in more detail now. But generally speaking, I have this box at the bottom. We helped get the first 10 gigawatts in the water. You could make that number 20. There's a lot of this progress is being driven by state initiatives. And if I count the number of policy commitments that are out there, it's about 17 gigawatts right now through 2030. You could increase that number, but if you wanted to count some of the legislation that's in progress right now. But there's a lot going on in this initial push, and we want to use this consortium as a tool to enable that first development. Okay, so my clicker works. So pillar one is, I want to go back. Okay, so I think there was a delay, but pillar one solicitation is fixed bottom technology. And the numbers that I've put on the side, these are bubbles indicating that these are part of the challenge areas that we're initiated and solicited in the first solicitation. So if you see a bubble, that means it's already out there in the solicitation. The first one is array performance and control optimization. This has to do with increasing the energy density and developing wind plant controls that will enable the wind farms to act as a full system. And I can't go into a lot of detail for each of these because there's a lot of areas, so I'm going to keep moving through. The second area, and this I encourage everybody to read the solicitation and get the full details of this, so I'll just brush through this. Cost reducing turbine support structures for the US market. We recognize that there's a lot of work that's already been done in Europe, but in the United States there's unique conditions with the restrictions that are imposed by the Jones Act, differences in soil types, and a desire to use in a better way the U.S. supply chain that's either already here or needs to be developed so that we have more local content. So reducing these support structures could manifest themselves in many different ways. I might say the same thing for the power systems and design innovation. We have a 60 hertz grid here that needs to be connected to all these wind projects, and there could be dozens of them. We need to be able to efficiently bring the cables to shore and connect to that onshore grid in the best possible way. And as we do that, there are innovations that are being proposed out there. There's solutions to avoid the substation, high voltage cables, to minimize the cost of building that offshore grid, and ways to avoid just the lengths of cables being buried in the seabed to avoid conflicts with the fishermen. So there's a lot to be done here, and this is part of the solicitation that's out there. And I've just shown a few examples of the array stuff on the right-hand side, because that's an area of technological advance that's happening right now, both for the fixed bottom and for the floating. Okay, so pillar one, there's some roadmap topics that were not included in the solicitation, and we'll get to these maybe at sometime in the future, but they're important as well. We see that a lot of the turbine sizes are increasing right now. The turbine, GE just announced a 12 megawatt machine. Siemens has a 10 megawatt machine that's being prototyped right now. The industry is tooled for 10 megawatt machines. It's not tooled currently for 12 and 15 megawatt machines, but that's where we're going. So this area of research is something, it's not just a US issue, it's a global issue, and it's something that we'll be tackling in the next few years, both in the test facilities, the development of the turbines themselves, and the way that we can install them. Hurricane resiliency is something that we need to address in order to expand the resource area into the southern latitudes in the Gulf of Mexico. Something that I think will happen. It's really a question of when it will happen. And we need strategies that will make the hurricane resilient turbines just as reliable as turbines installed in regions where there are no hurricanes. We need to manage the extreme loads. We need ride-through controls for hurricanes and strategies for how to deal with different events as they come through, and better ways of predicting what those events will be like so that we can design to them. And ultimately, all this can be rolled up into the standards, which we're working on as we speak. Some companies are already doing this right now. Siemens and Vestas are working on Taiwan based machines which have typhoons already. Moving to floating, we have one more challenge area that's in the floating substructures. We want to be able to address in the United States shallow water moorings, which are not really part of the technology base right now, and also deep water moorings, which are more prevalent on the Pacific coast. These are in the solicitation, and you can read about them. But in addition to that, we have other technology areas that we want to address. Floating platform scaling, similar to the large turbine scaling, control of large floating arrays. These will be different than the fixed fixed arrays, fixed bottom arrays, because there's more degrees of freedom in the turbine motion, and therefore some of the control strategies that work for fixed bottom won't work for floating arrays, and they have to be reassessed. And in the development of optimized floating systems, there'll be a whole new wave of floating system design tool development that will be necessary to capture the way that optimized floating systems work. There'll be turbines that are designed specifically for floating systems. There'll be flexible substructures that need to be incorporated into the design tools. And these are gaps that are currently in the tools that may be addressed in future roadmaps. And there's one area that I left off here that I want to mention. It's floating. It's designed for floating systems in the Great Lakes where there might be ice conditions, and that's not included here, but it's something that we think might be important in the future. Moving to Pillar 2. This, as Richard said, this hasn't been released yet in any of the solicitations, so we're not ready to announce a down select. But the four groupings here, the first three have to do with the wind resource assessment, comprehensive resource assessment of the United States. We realize that the uncertainty in the current assessments is probably too high for a lot of the developers, and may not be adequate for predicting cost, for predicting the design conditions and the grid load matching that's necessary, especially on the very long, time series and the short time scales. We have a lack of measurements in the ocean. Most of our measurements come from surface-based buoys, and we need to increase that. LiDAR systems have been deployed, but there's as a measurement campaign, we need more measurements at altitudes where wind turbines operate. The development of the MedOcean, a reference site that could do this, is something that's in the roadmap right now, and is something that we need to address eventually. And this would be an actual reference site that is located out on the outer continental shelf somewhere, that could aid developers in calibrating their instruments and understanding the unique conditions that are out there. And the final one is a seabed survey methods and geophysical geotechnical database, which could help us improve the understanding of the soils and what's under the seabed. Moving to Pillar 3. There it is. Pillar 3 is really divided into three topics: installation, O&M, and supply chain. So the first topic, installation, will address installation technologies to reduce siting conflicts. So this is actually an interface with some of the use and environmental impacts that might be out there. We have, as examples shown here, and this is not an exhaustive list, but passive and active subsea acoustic monitoring that might relate to marine mammals, turbine controls with integrated automatic and automated optical systems for avian and bat detection. So this is better ways to avoid impacts with avian and bat species, and other methods for safe deterrence for reducing wildlife interactions. The floating turbine installation strategies is an interesting one. That it is basically, we know that the cost of floating systems will be dependent on the ability to bring as much labor inshore as we can. But the question here is, will the ports and harbors that we have be able to provide the adequate resources to provide that assembly and to provide the inshore O&M that's necessary? And this would be a study to look at that. Heavy lift vessel alternatives is very critical, because the Jones Act prohibits non-U.S. flagged vessels, which would come from Europe, to deliver from port to port in the United States. So got to be a different strategy that we use in the United States than what's used in Europe, and this would look at variety of innovations to counter some of those barriers that might come up. Moving to the next part of Pillar 3, we have O&M topics. O&M is something that's being dealt with globally, but from a U.S. perspective, we would like to be able to minimize the work that's done at sea through advancements in the way we use data that's coming from the turbines. There's a lot of data that's being collected, but it's not necessarily being collected in the most intelligent, or it's not being fully utilized, let's say. And then there's a lot of other sensors that could be added to turbines to enhance the way data is collected through advanced data analytics, machine learning, condition monitoring, advanced sensors to deal with robotics, drones to inspect, autonomous vehicles to inspect either under the water or on the surface, and then other materials that might advantage or reduce the number of hours that we have to spend at sea. There's a need to increase or better the testing methods that are used to, especially, and it's been mentioned by me, I guess, to extend the testing methods to deal with larger turbines and larger blades. And these could be done in the existing test facilities or development of new test facilities that would either enable these larger systems to be tested in a shorter test time than what's currently possible, to increase the accuracy of these tests, to make sure that we catch problems in the test facility that might not go out into the field. We have to be able to do as good a job in the laboratory, because the bigger the machines get, the more expensive a field failure gets. The next item is high sea state crew transfer solutions. This is particularly going to be important on the Pacific, where we have higher sea states on a regular basis. And there's a lot of work being done on this in Europe already, but we need to be able to safely transfer the crews from the ship to the turbines in higher and higher sea states, so that we can access the turbines more frequently. And the last one here is O&M strategies and tools. And this is a really big area, but it could come into just exactly how an O&M strategy is implemented using our existing ports, understanding how to shoehorn in O&M service through different weather windows and weather conditions, how to deal with the bathymetry in different regions, how to train the crew, and the training is very important in this, and determine what vessels are most needed in doing the types of service that's going to be needed. So that kind of gives everybody a flavor for what's in the roadmap. I forgot supply chain. I'm sorry. I have one more. And supply chain is probably one of the most talked about topics in the consortium, because this is where a lot of the developers are worrying, where product is going to come from, and the states that are sponsoring some of this legislation expect that supply chain and technology and jobs will come to their region. So we want to encourage technology solutions to accelerate the U.S. supply chain in various areas, and that really is cross-cutting across many of the topics that we have that I've already mentioned. Another, probably maybe one of the biggest areas is the grid access, and how we are going to connect all of this power into the existing grid. The first project will have no problem in most areas. The second project may have a little bit more difficulty connecting to the onshore grid. After that, we're going to start building a much more difficult situation if we don't address it up front, on how all these projects will come in, and ultimately we're going to have to make modifications to the land-based grid, and probably in a fairly big way. So that is something that needs to be addressed, needs to be understood, and these topics will address that. And I would say the same thing on the port study. We really need to understand not just what ports there are, but what specific changes need to be made to these ports, not just to address the turbines that are being developed today, but what to address the turbines that are going to be built in 10 years from now. What will a 15 megawatt turbine require in terms of a port and harbor in order to be useful to the offshore wind industry? And so now with that, I will turn this back over to Richard, how to get involved.
Great, thanks, Walt. That was it's very comprehensive. There's a lot in the roadmap, and really appreciate Walt's leadership in helping us to put that together. So I guess, for a lot of folks, the first way to get involved is please take a look at our solicitation. And if you have a project to propose in one of those technical challenge areas that's open, we would love to hear from you. I also want to tell everybody that the solicitation is, like I said before, continually open. It also means we'll be continually awarding projects, as they come in on their merit, and we may commit that funding at any time. So if you've got a great idea, please don't hold on to it. Other ways to get involved, I mentioned advisory groups, and also earlier noted that we have many public and private sponsors. So if your organization is in a position to become one of those, please contact me. We'd love to talk to you. Again, we're looking for the consortium to have great representation from national stakeholders who can support the goal of long-term self-sufficiently in service to the American offshore wind industry. I've also mentioned the advisory groups, so here's a little bit more detail about those. The advisory groups each interface with consortium staff to advise and support the mission, and each one of these advisory groups is meant to represent a different aspect of stakeholder and give different and complementary input to the consortium in helping it to achieve its goals. So the largest one, and the one that's, I think, furthest along right now, is the Research and Development Advisory Group, the RDAG. This is made up primarily of colleges and universities, national labs, and other research organizations. And we work with them for input to the roadmap. So we always talk about a market pull. Much of the roadmap was assembled by the subject matter experts who come from the developers that are sponsors of the consortium. But there also needs to be if that's the pull, the push comes from the research community, continually advising on what's possible and what should be considered for exploration. The RDAG will also work to disseminate knowledge, and of course, RDAG members, we would expect many of them would want to participate in the projects and be applying for R&D project funding through the competitive process. The Strategic Advisory Network can also be made up of academic institutions, utilities, state, federal authorities, non-government organizations. These are primarily folks who can advise consortium staff and board on strategic matters, where to focus the resources and activities of the consortium, again to best support the U.S. offshore wind industry. Representing the supply chain manufacturers, we have the Manufacturing Supply Chain and Service Council, made up of primarily, tier one OEMs down through, the full supply chain. So again, from this group, we would hope to get input on factors affecting O&M, supply chain costs, other factors, and also especially for the OEMs and the next tiers. Supporting the technology vision by giving their perspective and their company's priorities for development of technology. And then finally, the tech to market group. The consortium has a very strong commercialization focus. We don't want any technology that we fund or is developed to sit on a shelf and not get into turbines in the water. So the tech to market group is intended to include investors, venture capital, entrepreneurs, philanthropic organizations, and technology incubators, who we hope will be able to connect innovators with commercialization partners through investment. So people who are in the tech to market group will have the opportunity to evaluate the technology, make some of those connections, and invest in it. And I do want to stress here that again, the solicitations are completely open. You do not have to be a member of any advisory group in order to submit a proposal. You do not have to be a consortium sponsor, certainly, to submit a proposal. And in fact, in a lot of ways, we try to make a good, clean separation between the proposer community and the decision-making community, populated by some members of the consortium. So, these are great ways to get involved and help the consortium to accomplish its mission. But don't think that because you're not a member, you can't propose. In fact, we very much want you to. And so finally, I'll just say a little bit about the Research and Development Advisory Group, which we kicked off earlier this year. This is made up of, I think, several dozen universities at this point, with robust representation from all regions of the U.S. The RDAG has elected an interim leadership team to get the group stood up, establish some operating principles, bring additional members into the group, and then go forward in supporting the consortium mission. So you may know some of these folks. Fotis Soteropoulos from Stony Brook was elected chair. Amy Halloran from Sandia is the vice chair. And Habib Dagher is a well-known researcher in offshore wind at University of Maine as the secretary. So if you have an interest in joining the RDAG, you can contact me or one of these folks. And again, if you've got interest in joining one of the other advisory groups, please contact me. I'll put you in touch with the right folks. And similarly, if you're in a position to consider joining the consortium board as a public or private sponsor, I'd love to talk with you about that offline. And with that, thank you all very much. Appreciate your attention. There's our contact information for any follow-ups, and I'll turn it back over to the organizers now.
Great. Thank you, Richard. Thank you, Walt. All right, let's move on to some questions. So some questions generally about the consortium. Can you talk a little bit more about the structure, the differences between consortium members and the advisory committee, specifically who contributes financially, and a little bit more about how to get involved in advisory groups, like how often you meet and how?
Yeah, I'd be happy to take that. So the advisory groups are not voting members of the consortium. From a 501c3 not-for-profit fiduciary standpoint, they are not capital M members of the consortium. There is no financial commitment required from the advisory groups. If you're in an advisory group, and again, we're just getting a lot of this started, I would expect to be invited to a meeting, maybe quarterly by phone conference. I would expect to be polled with some frequency by Walt or me or consortium staff as we're putting together future iterations of roadmaps and technical challenges. I might imagine it's not too unlike being a member of CESA, if I could be so bold. So that's a bit different from the sponsor members of the consortium who do have a financial commitment, excepting a couple of the independent members, such as the chair. But generally, the public sponsors and the companies and developers who have chosen to become private sponsors do make a financial commitment. The dues support consortium activities, and again, go towards that long-term mission of self-sufficiency for the consortium.
Perfect, thank you. And I noticed that, for example, I believe you have a member of the Carbon Trust participating in the consortium. How can other foreign government agencies join the consortium or the advisory groups?
Right. So that's yeah. So Carbon Trust, is a UK consultancy, of course, and their experience, and one of the reasons we're very excited to have them with us as a proposal partner is, of course, in setting up the offshore wind accelerator in Europe and having had experience with building a consortium, a successful consortium there. So this is, of course, coming from a US DOE award, and it's very much targeted, actually exclusively targeted for the United States offshore wind market. So participation by non-US entities so let me start with the awards. Participation by non-US entities in research awards, that's fine, generally as a subcontractor. And provided that the research topic supports the U.S. wind industry, for instance, by technology transfer from Europe, or by simply working to directly to build it in the United States. And any foreign work would have to be subject to the U.S. DOE granting a waiver for that work. So that's with respect to the project funding, and of course Carbon Trust meets those criteria. They are involved with the consortium, again, from their expertise in bringing innovative technology to market in Europe. They are using that expertise to help us do it in the U.S. With respect generally to foreign entities, being a part of consortium advisory groups, I mean, there's really no, there's no hard limit on that, provided again that everybody is supporting the mission to develop the United States offshore wind market and industry, along with U.S.-based manufacturing and the supply chain.
Thank you for that very thorough response, Richard. And so following up on that, can you talk a little bit more about any overlap with research and development priorities going on in the EU, like at the Carbon Trust or other accelerators?
We haven't specifically addressed that. I mean, of course, I guess the main thing is that both Carbon Trust and there are some UK-based folks in RCG as well with this experience. We leverage that experience. I mean, I think everybody, us and DOE included, recognizes that Europe started before we did. They're a little bit further down the road. We have some unique challenges in the U.S. market that Europe hasn't faced. For example, our water depth, our wind and wave conditions. So, a big part of the goal here is technology transfer. another part of it is adapting and developing technology in different areas to deal with our unique U.S. conditions. But definitely for the transfer bit of it, we can learn a lot from what research has already been done in Europe and what expertise Carbon Trust, RCG, and other companies with experience there can bring to the U.S. market.
Yeah, I would add that one of the values of having the Carbon Trust on the core team of the consortium is to help us understand and evaluate whether a project that we're funding is duplicative or whether it's overlapping in various ways with research that's already ongoing, either in the Carbon Trust or in Europe, because they have a better perspective on some of that than we do sitting here in the U.S. We also have most of the developers in the world that sit on the board of directors that will correct us on that if we get too far off from what's of value to a U.S. development project.
Thanks, Walt. That makes sense. Well, picking up on that, I assume that both the U.S. and globally, Europe and elsewhere, everyone's facing the same challenge on how to deal with larger turbines, larger blades on the horizon. Walt, you mentioned the U.S. is going to need could need new test facilities. How is the consortium addressing those research needs?
Well, as you saw, that's one of the areas, topics in the roadmap that we've identified as being a research need, and we haven't addressed it yet. It's not part of any of the solicitations yet. It's expected that we will talk about that. I can say that this is not a topic just in the consortium. It's being discussed outside the consortium as well. And as you said, it's a topic that all of the countries dealing with large turbines are going to have to face. I think specifically in the United States, we have domestic facilities that are targeted to test the offshore wind turbines that are going in the water, and those facilities specifically would perhaps benefit the most by the consortium getting involved in solutions to the larger machines.
I should add that one of the conditions of the DOE award is that it supports technology, but the DOE award and therefore the NYSERDA match to the DOE award does not go to fund new facilities, infrastructures. So of course, including test facilities. So it is an important technology topic. Technology that enhances capability of testing for larger and larger structures is definitely in the roadmap and definitely important. But the DOE NYSERDA funding cannot go to build those test facilities. That said, one of the key values that some of our partners, especially the public sponsors, bring is access for consortium projects to the facilities that they sponsor. So, for instance, Mass CEC, of course, has the WTTC, the Wind Turbine Technology Center, with a large blade test facility. Virginia DMME brings along their research lease, and again, we hope to add additional public sponsors and facilities who can build out that network of key research assets that the consortium can continue to leverage. It's another reason that we structured it the way we did. Again, to try to leverage those existing resources, knowing that that the award was focused on other things besides developing those facilities.
Thanks for that clarification, Richard. Well, you mentioned some challenges, including some port challenges. So will there be a national port assessment as part of the R&D consortium that perhaps identifies opportunities and the needed upgrades and changes to meet see the future offshore wind market and technology?
Well, these are ports come in at least a couple areas in the roadmap topics. One, it's mentioned as a major area that has to be overcome in the development of floating systems. If floating systems are to become economical and cost effective, we need to be able to assemble them at quayside in a port. And it's not clear at this point which ports or how many of our ports could be adapted to do that. So that's one area. And just in general, the near-term fixed bottom systems need to be able to access multiple ports. Some of these are already being developed on the East Coast, and the details of how those ports need to be modified and developed is certainly part of the prioritization in it becoming part of the roadmap. And we haven't announced yet what the topics are for the first round on Pillar 3. That would be a Pillar 3 topic, but it is intended that those topics will get addressed eventually.
Thank you. Given the challenges with the existing port infrastructure, to what extent is the oil and gas industry involved in the research consortium? For example, a question came in that the oil and gas industry has the technology to deploy and anchor and supply offshore wind, deep water stabilized work platforms, and whether these are viable solutions for offshore wind assembly or O&M.
I guess I'll take a crack. Yeah, I'll take the first crack at that, Walt, and feel free to take a swing yourself. Okay. I can say that I have received several inquiries from O&G, supply chain members, asking about technologies like that could be adapted. To offshore wind foundations and also to, offshore wind installation and O&M. So yeah, when we release Pillar 3, I'm hoping very much to hear some of those proposals.
Yeah, and I guess I would add that it's becoming more and more difficult to separate the oil and gas industry from the offshore wind industry. There's if you define the oil and gas industry as the oil companies as well as the contractors that work for those oil companies, we're already working with them to develop not just the ports and infrastructure, but to do the offshore construction, the engineering designs, and so forth. So it's already, that integration is already happening. As far as the ports and infrastructure are concerned, it's a lot of the companies that we know that are working through those solutions, and some of that does involve the oil companies. And I guess I would just point out that a lot of the leases that were purchased on the East Coast were oil companies that bought them. So they have a strong interest in making sure that these port facilities are adapted properly.
That's a great point. Thanks. All right, I see that we are closing in on the hour. So one last question, and I think it's a quick one. Will any of the data coming out of the R&D consortium be available publicly, or will all of it?
Yeah, I could say that most, if not all, of the data coming out of the R&D consortium will be publicly available. There are, of course, going to be exceptions, but generally this is a publicly funded consortium, so we are funding in the public interest. Now we also have a strong commercialization focus. So depending on the project, the best service to the public may be for one or more companies to commercialize an innovation. However, yes, so for things like, data that's gained in the course of developing site assessment tools, that's expected to be, again, per DOE, per some of the DOE requirements on this, that data is expected to be, available for the benefit of the developer community and the offshore wind industry.
Thank you. All right, we have reached the top of the hour, so I want to thank both of you for your great presentations and all the information, and thank you to all the attendees for listening in and submitting questions, and to Sam for hosting us. As Sam mentioned at the start of this webinar was recorded and will be available both on the CESA website, and if you registered for the webinar, you'll receive a link to the recording in a day or two. If you have any follow-up questions, feel free to reach out to me. My email's up on the screen, as well as some links to other resources. Thank you, everyone. Have a great day.